Transphobes have really stepped up their attacks the past 2 years, targeting not just individual trans people, but domestic abuse and rape crisis centres throughout the UK for refusing to bow down to their anti-science, anti-human rights ideology. And today we'll be taking a look at one such example. But before that, I first need to give a content warning for the following topics: sexual assault, domestic abuse, racism, anti-Semitism, ableism, homophobia, and transmisogyny. If you like our work and appreciate the research put into each video, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon. You can also support us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. Hi there, my name's Ethel Thurston, and today we'll be taking another look into the depravity that is the transphobic movement in the UK, the gender-critical ideology, and their ongoing crusade against victims of rape and domestic abuse. Because that is exactly what it is. An ideologically driven campaign of violence that seeks to destroy some of the most vulnerable people in our society. We've previously covered the attacks on Rape Crisis Scotland over the appointment of an Indian trans woman, Midul Vadva, to the role of CEO for Rape Crisis Edinburgh in May of last year. Ms. Vadva is a veteran of the field, having worked for Rape Crisis Scotland, Forth Valley Rape Crisis Centre, and Shakti Women's Aid over the years, earning herself an upstanding reputation regarding her care for victims of sexual violence. Sadly, that didn't stop the gender-critical ideologues from launching a racist, misogynistic, and transphobic smear campaign targeting both Ms. Vadva and Rape Crisis Scotland. Said abuse became so bad that it forced the group to temporarily close down communications, something the gender-critical crowd celebrated, in spite of how it directly hurt all victims of rape and sexual violence. We then have the time Surrey Police and Crime Commissioner Lisa Townsend label Stonewall a, quote, threat to women, end quote, and spread anti-Semitic conspiracies about so-called, quote, trans lobby groups, end quote, infiltrating British schools, a narrative shared by her and the Buffalo shooter. And whilst I done a video covering that, it's important to note that Ms. Townsend did so as part of an attempt to vilify victims of rape and domestic abuse for seeking support, all on the grounds that they are transgender, with SPC Townsend stating that their inclusion was wholly misogynistic and potentially dangerous. A fact I bring up now to show how the horror of today's video really is indicative of the gender-critical ideology as a whole. This isn't merely a once-off, but a pattern of violent behaviour aimed at victims of rape and abuse. This week's target is the Survivors Network, a rape crisis centre in Brighton, Sussex, who has had a lawsuit launched against them. Why? Well, because they refused to deny service to a trans victim of sexual violence at the demand of another service user, with said demand being made solely on the basis that said trans person is trans. Yeah, it really is as bad as it sounds. Though the story first came to light months ago via the fascist rag, the Daily Mail, which published an article last November under the following headline: Rape victim is forced to quit her therapy sessions because she feels threatened by a 6-foot trans woman in men's clothes who, a woke charity insists, has as much right to be there as she does. And holy fucking shit, could you write a more cliched and thoroughly transphobic headline? I guess it is the Daily Mail, but just because it comes as no real surprise due to its source, that doesn't mean we should allow ourselves to be numb to such blatant bigotry. As for what actually happened, Sarah Summers attended group therapy at the Survivors Network Centre in Brighton, during which a trans woman joined said sessions. Now, rather than respect the fact that this trans person, whom I shall be referring to as Olivia from here on in, not her real name, was a rape victim seeking support, Ms. Summers set out to exclude her from public services. After attacking Olivia's physical appearance in a letter sent to the Survivors Network, Ms. Summers demanded that they set up a women's group that excluded trans women, a move that would have been entirely discriminatory under the Equality Act had they done so. More on that later. Yet, more importantly, it violated their established code of ethics, with the Survivors Network being a vocally trans-inclusive organisation, a fact Ms. Summers admits to being aware of at the time. So this isn't trans women invade women's spaces, It's transphobe users trans-inclusive services only to become infuriated when they see a trans person using said service. Ms. Summers is the invader here. Now, said services being trans-inclusive should come as no surprise to anyone, since you can't have feminism without trans liberation, and the pretense otherwise is what has led to anti-abortionists being allowed into self-declared feminist circles, gradually eroding away reproductive rights whilst pretending like they are protecting women. It's why Liz Truss, the anti-trans ghoul who was appointed Minister for Women and Equalities by the Tory government, regularly makes appearances at the Heritage Foundation, an anti-LGBT+, anti-abortion far-right organisation. It's why one of the lawyers behind the Bell v Tavistock case, a case that sought to limit the medical autonomy of trans people, was Paul Conraith, a Christian zealot who has made a personal career out of trying to get abortion banned in the UK, and has even personally represented in court men trying to force their former partners to give birth. It's why J.K. Rowling is not only personal friends, but routinely helps boost the likes of Emma Nicholson, a UK baroness who has attempted to introduce legislation restricting abortion as recently as 2017. Feminism without trans liberation isn't feminism, it's patriarchy that's learned how to disguise itself in sheep's clothing to invent a danger to curtail women's rights. That is what the gender-critical ideology is. A Trojan horse designed to sneak the most horrific misogyny imaginable into respectable discourse. A fact we cannot afford to lose sight of, because when we do, well, we saw what happened in the US recently. That was, in part, the direct result of bodily autonomy being eroded by anti-trans movements like the gender-critical ideology. So the Survivors Network naturally responded to Ms. Summers, stating that they were willing to offer her one-to-one therapy, yet they would not set up a public service for women just to exclude a subset of women from said service. Certainly not on the basis that said women have a protected characteristic, that is, their trans status. Here is how the Daily Mail reported things. Quote, "But a reply from Carries Jenkins, head of operations at the charity, ruled out any change of policy. We do not police gender and we do not define who is and is not a woman. We allow women to define this for themselves," she wrote. The letter added, in what Sarah considers a cruel snub, that her primary option was to move to one-to-one support or find another service in the city which may be suitable for you. End quote. So even Ms. Summers, and by extension the Daily Mail, admitted that the Survivors Network took steps to try and ensure that Sarah still received the support she needed, they just wouldn't discriminate against other victims of sexual violence to do so. And yet Ms. Summers tries to pass this off as a cruel snub, presenting it as a personal slight, rather than a group trying to help her to the fullest extent they could, without resorting to violence against trans victims of sexual violence, as Ms. Summers demanded. Because Ms. Summers was demanding violence against trans women, just not physical violence. One thing I noticed about the way in which this topic is being reported on, particularly by those supporting Ms. Summers, is the way in which discrimination, specifically direct discrimination as is discussed in Chapter 2 of the Equality Act, is being presented as both passive and harmless, when that couldn't be further from the truth. Let's just consider what it would look like if Ms. Summers had her way. How would the Survivors Network exclude trans women from women's meetings? Well, they could either publicly broadcast the fact that trans women are not welcomed, effectively putting a "No Trans Women" sign on the door of said meetings and in all posts advertising said events, reminiscent of anti-Irish, anti-Roma and anti-black segregation, or they could wait for trans people to inquire about the meetings or potentially even turn up on the basis that they are women, only for them to be turned away, what is likely to be a painful interaction which could easily escalate into an anti-trans mob. Either way, this harms trans people in two fundamental ways. First, it strips them of their dignity, humanity, and autonomy, declaring them to be fake women. And that last one, denying a trans victim of rape and abuse their autonomy as they seek support, I hope it goes without saying just how damaging that is in particular. Second, it effectively punishes trans women for the crimes committed by a completely different group, something that is actually a human rights violation, so not something a rape crisis center should ever be involved with. It also reinforces this myth that trans women are inherently dangerous, which plays a major role in justifying violence against trans women and AMAB trans folk. Trans women are not men, they're not male-bodied. And that's not something I just came up with, it's the consensus shared by prestigious scientific institutions such as the Endocrine Society, the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists, the American Society of Andrology, the European Society for Pediatric Endocrinology, the European Society of Endocrinology, the Pediatric Endocrine Society, and the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, all of whom refer to trans women as trans females and trans men as trans males. The person defines the parts, not the other way round. That is literally feminism 101. Women are not merely walking vaginas, and any misogynist asshole who would pretend otherwise can piss off. Now, these are not the only way said actions would harm trans victims of rape and sexual assault, but they go to show that there is no way to exclude trans women from women's groups without harming them. So yes, Ms. Summers was demanding the Survivors Network enact violence against trans service users on her behalf. And once we acknowledge this very simple fact, we can change the form of violence to something people are more akin to taking seriously as a means of asking ourselves whether Ms. Summers is being reasonable. For example, what if, instead of demanding the Survivors Network create services with the explicit intent of discriminating against trans women, she instead demanded that they physically assault any trans woman who attempted to attend their meetings? Would that be reasonable? No. Would Ms. Summers' status as a rape victim in any way make said violence reasonable? Absolutely not. Ergo, it is not reasonable in this situation either, and is why I, a victim of sexual assault who grew up in a domestic violence refuge, will not be discussing Ms. Summers' status as a victim beyond this point, because it is irrelevant to the matter at hand. But beyond the abstract, Ms. Summers is also attacking Olivia whilst claiming not to do so. So much of what Ms. Summers says, the way she's focusing on Olivia's appearance, making transphobic remarks, is personal, not abstract. What's more is, it's incredibly misogynistic, transphobic, and homophobic. Ms. Summers is effectively demanding that the Survivors Network punishes Olivia for not presenting how Ms. Summers demands a woman present in public, demonizing Olivia's, quote, casual trousers and sweatshirt, end quote. I'm sorry, did Ms. Summers think she was attending a fucking red carpet event with cocktail dresses? Who the fuck is she to dictate what a woman may wear? Olivia is a rape victim, and rather than center that, Ms. Summers is publicly scrutinizing how Olivia is dressed as a means of delegitimizing her right to access support. There is no difference between what Ms. Summers is doing here and what rape apologists do when they try to call into question whether a person was technically raped since they were dressed in revealing clothing that they believe constitutes consent. And that's without even considering the fact that most casual clothing is loose-fitting, which is something many victims of sexual violence seek comfort in. So not only is she targeting a trans victim of sexual violence, throwing out every cliche under the sun, but she's actually targeting something that helps many victims of sexual violence live day-to-day life. But yeah, if it hadn't been about Olivia in particular, Ms. Summers wouldn't be describing her clothing, her height, or her voice in such a dehumanizing and misogynistic manner, as if there are no cis women taller than 6 feet and that all cis women have voices like honey. I've grown up around Dutch German smokers. Take it from me, that's not true. Which highlights another danger in what Ms. Summers is doing, how she's endangering cis women as well, since even if we accept her bigoted premise that trans women should be excluded from women's services for presenting too masculine, that opens the floodgates to all sorts of misogyny. all of a sudden any cis woman can and will be policed, potentially being expelled on similar grounds. This is not an abstract, by the way. This already happens, frequently. The most recent instance, at the time of writing this, got reported on the 20th of May and involved a disabled queer cis woman, Tay Beals, who tried to use the toilets at a Marks & Spencer store. This one was a double whammy, with Tay being blocked by a member of staff from using the disabled toilet on grounds that their disability wasn't visible. Then, as Tay went to use the woman's toilet, the same staff member blocked her, arguing that Tay, who again is a cis woman, wasn't a woman due to her short hair. This is why the far right loves this argument. They see it as a way to not only hurt trans people, but force cis women to conform to conservative ideals of femininity, undoing many of the advancements made by feminism over the past couple centuries. Meanwhile, if Miss Summers is fine with cis women presenting in a similar fashion to Olivia, that reveals to us that the problem was never the presentation, but the fact that Olivia is trans and Miss Summers feels entitled to punish her for said fact. It's also important to note that not all groups of women will be harmed by said policies equally. Black and darker skinned South Asian women already suffer hyper-policing regarding their gender, being perceived and presented as manly and aggressive as a means of dehumanizing them, arguments white supremacists do in fact use to argue that they should be segregated from what said supremacists perceive as white women's spaces. In fact, many of the methods used in trans misogyny were first developed and perfected through decades of misogyny, which is part of the reason black trans women suffer particularly high levels of violence, since these things amplify one another. On top of that, we have intersex people, making up an estimated 2% of the population, people whose bodies exist outside of the arbitrary and naive notions of male and female. Whenever trans people are targeted, intersex people are also made to suffer on the same basis and vice versa, as seen in sports with groups like World Athletics having deliberately conflated the two. Then we have lesbians, who, through being sexually liberated, are more likely to reject the previously mentioned conservative ideals of femininity, making them prime targets for transphobia. A fact I find particularly important considering how Ms. Summers' associates openly acknowledged that the Survivors Network was established by lesbians in part, only to ignore how Ms. Summers' bigotry will directly prevent many lesbians from using said services. After all, who's to say they won't be assumed to be trans women, as we saw with Ms. Beals earlier? And nobody, absolutely nobody, wants to be treated like a trans woman. Not in our society. Ms. Summers does not have the right to demand a group exclude any subset of women, whether they be trans, black, intersex, or lesbian, from women's services. She is the danger to them, not the other way around. And whilst marginalised folk may create smaller groups for their own protection, that does not give Ms. Summers the right to exclude them from the general group. Of course, that's not what was presented by the Daily Mail and other far-right blogs. Olivia was stripped of her humanity and her trauma, dressed up as a caricature, and publicly smeared as part of the ongoing attacks on trans people in the UK. Though that's where the story seemed to end, at least for a while. Then, on the 3rd of May, the London-based employment law firm, Did Law, published an official statement on behalf of Ms. Summers. I'm going to break this up into 3 sections to make it easier to respond to. Did Law stated, quote, Did Law is a specialist discrimination law firm based in London. Did Law is representing Sarah Summers, a rape survivor, in her case against Brighton's Rape Crisis Centre Survivors Network. Proceedings have been issued in the Brighton County Court. The case is against the Survivors Network, the only rape crisis centre in Sussex, and its refusal to provide a women-only peer support group for victims of sexual abuse and violence. On first using the service in 2021, Ms. Summers felt relief at being able to share her story of sexual abuse and rape with women with similar experiences. She attended weekly sessions, which were helpful and supportive. From September 2021, things changed. A trans woman joined the group, which made Ms. Summers feel deeply uncomfortable. She raised the fact of her discomfort with the network, but was told that, despite there being another group available for trans, non-binary, and intersex survivors, it was the policy of the network to allow anyone identifying as a woman to join the group. End quote. So the first thing that sticks out to me here is the fact that Diddlaw has confirmed that Olivia is a trans woman. Now, non-binary people are welcome to use these services provided by the Survivors Network, but it's important to this case, legally, that Diddlaw has officially referred to Olivia as a trans woman, whilst hinging Ms. Summers' claims on the notion that the Survivors Network is meant to offer a women-only peer support group for victims of sexual abuse and violence. By Diddlaw's own admission, the Survivors Network hasn't breached that in any way, and the only way to argue otherwise is to argue that Olivia is not a woman, which is highly transphobic and scientifically illiterate, not to mention is now contradicted by their own public statement. So that to me seems like a complete failure to comprehend how their own statements can be taken and presented in court. Of course, that's not why Diddlaw's doing this, rather they're trying to hide behind what they perceive to be the ambiguity of the term trans woman as a singular noun, rather than trans being an adjective added onto woman. But this does leave them and Miss Summers open to being questioned on the line I just gave. If either Diddlaw or Miss Summers state that trans women aren't women, well, that's a strike against them. If they acknowledge they are, well, they have no case. Now, I think the way they'll try to get around this is via a bait and switch, one we actually see in the following paragraphs. Quote, "The response of the network was that Ms. Summers should find another service in Brighton, there is none, or one-to-one support. They ruled out a change of policy. Sarah Summers was effectively pushed out of the group. She was removed from the network's mailing list and blocked on Twitter. The legal case is that such a policy is indirectly discriminatory because it puts women with Sarah's experience at a particular disadvantage, which cannot be justified. Other claims include harassment, victimization, and personal injury. Some female survivors have a trauma response to men, and it is not appropriate for biological males to share their survivor network. Victims of sexual abuse and violence need to be able to share feelings and experiences in a safe, single-sex environment." End quote. So here we moved on from discussion about women and women's groups to terms such as female and biological males. This is jargonization, a form of obscuring reliant on technical-sounding language to pretend like they have a case. As already shown, this idea that trans women are biologically male does not stand from a perspective of actual science, which updates itself as new evidence changes our understanding. Hopefully Reed Smith, the lawyers representing the Survivors Network, catch on to this and nip it in the bud before returning to the language of women. Not simply out of respect for trans people, with Diddlaw's actions here being a form of misgendering, but because that's the language upon which the Survivors Network founded itself. There's a reason Diddlaw forwarded the Survivors Network services as a women-only peer support group rather than a female-only peer support group. And that's because no rape crisis center is running around calling itself a female service. So they have to use women whilst introducing the topic before switching to female. Another problem with this argument is the fact that, as noted by Ms. Summers supporters, lesbians also use said services, and whilst a number of them will be victims of assault by men, there will also be victims of assault by women, because yes, women do assault people. Both myself and my brother were raped by a cis woman whilst we were children living inside a domestic violence refuge. Women do not lack the capacity for sexual violence, and it's dangerous to pretend otherwise. The reason women have needed to create these services is because they are a marginalized group. They are a disempowered demographic whose autonomy is seen as an affront to the status quo, just like trans people. As for the Survivors Network blocking Ms. Summers, what should they have done other than enact violence against trans victims of rape? They tried to work with her, they offered her one-to-one support. If she then continued to demand that they enact violence towards other service users, blocking was the reasonable thing to do. Because no, being a victim of rape does not excuse attempting to force a rape crisis center to enact violence against marginalized folk on your behalf. Which brings us round to the apparent legal framework that DID Law will be working with regarding their lawsuit, and that is the 2010 Equality Act, with their statement reading, quote, "The Equality Act 2010 prohibits discrimination based on sex or gender reassignment, but there are exceptions for certain groups where access can be modified or limited if there is a legitimate aim to protect. Guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission says that services should be open to trans people wherever possible. This case is about protecting the right for some services to remain single-sex spaces by law, where this is the most appropriate manner of safeguarding the rights of women. The rights of women to these spaces is vitally important and must be protected. The law is not clear, more guidance is needed. It is hoped that this case will assist in clarifying the law and provide service providers with a clear legal framework." End quote. Right, well, the part in question is Schedule 3, Part 7, Section 28, which reads as follows, quote, "A person does not contravene Section 29, provision of services, etc., so far as relating to gender reassignment discrimination, only because of anything done in relation to a matter within subparagraph 2, if the conduct in question is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. The matters are A. The provision of separate services for persons of each sex. B. The provision of separate services differently for persons of each sex. C. The provision of a service only to persons of one sex." End quote. Emphasis added by me. So the first thing to note here is the fact that nowhere does it state that the Survivors Network or similar services have to exclude trans people, which is the argument DID Law is making. Merely that there are grounds for exemption, providing that they are proportionate and help said organizations achieve a legitimate aim. There is nothing here that gives Ms. Summers the right to compel the Survivors Network to do anything. However, ignoring this glaring issue for a second, in order for DID Law to make the case that excluding trans women from women's services is proportionate, they'd have to argue that enacting violence against trans victims of rape and abuse is proportionate and achieves a legitimate aim, which it isn't and doesn't. But that is, ultimately, what they're going to have to argue. And whilst DID Law has asserted that the law isn't clear, the Equality and Human Rights Commission published guidelines in 2010 to accompany said law, giving very clear instructions on how said exemptions may be applied. The following comes from their Services, Public Functions and Associations Statutory Code of Practice. Quote, "As stated at the beginning of this chapter, any exception to the prohibition or discrimination must be applied as restrictively as possible, and the denial of a service to a transsexual person should only occur in exceptional circumstances. A service provider can have a policy on provision of the service to transsexual users, but should apply this policy on a case-by-case basis in order to determine whether the exclusion of a transsexual person is proportionate in the individual circumstances. Service providers will need to balance the need of the transsexual person for the service and the detriment to them if they are denied access against the needs of other service users and any detriment that may affect them if the transsexual person has access to the service. To do this will often require discussion with service users, maintaining confidentiality for the transsexual service user. Care should be taken in each case to avoid a decision based on ignorance or prejudice. Also, the provider will need to show that a less discriminatory way to achieve the objective was not available." End quote. So straight away, this guideline rules out a blanket ban on trans people from any service. So what Ms. Summers is demanding, a group which bans trans women by default, would be illegal under the Equality Act. Any exclusion has to be on a case-by-case basis, which, when it comes to rape crisis centres and domestic violence shelters, is something they already do. They already assess their service users to see whether they're a danger to the other users, both trans and cis. We also have the fact that the Survivors Network attempted to help Ms. Summers by offering one-to-one support, showing a less discriminatory way to achieve the objective of helping Ms. Summers, one that did not require violence against trans women. That Ms. Summers rejected said support on grounds that she believes violence against trans women to be proportionate is what the courts will have to rule on. Was that a fair standard? That's if Diddlaw can make the case that the Equality Act requires the Survivors Network to exclude trans people, because without that, this entire thing has been a pointless exercise. Now, there are a couple more points I'd like to touch on, the first being the fact that a trans person needn't be undergoing or having undergone medical transition in order to be protected under the Equality Act, with the EHRC stating the following in 2021. Quote, "To be protected from gender reassignment discrimination, you do not need to have undergone any specific treatment or surgery to change from your birth sex to your preferred gender. This is because changing your physiological or other gender attributes is a personal process rather than a medical one." End quote. I bring this up due to how Ms. Summers has tried to paint Olivia. I don't know whether Olivia is or has medically transitioned or not, so I just wanted to make this fact clear. It doesn't matter, she is protected. I also want to make clear that an employment tribunal ruled non-binary people to be protected as well, just in case Diddlaw decides to go after the fact that the Survivors Network provides support for them as well. Again, there's nothing compelling the Survivors Network to exclude anybody, but it's good to know that there's legal precedent on this as it could come up. Which brings us around to the Survivors Network and their response to this entire situation. Because there's a lot of ways they could have handled this. They could have clammed up and said nothing as things went to court, yet they instead released a statement on the 4th of May, reaffirming their commitment to supporting the trans community. It should also be noted that they updated said statement on the 10th of May, removing specifics regarding Diddlaw's suit since they still hadn't received the proper paperwork, meaning it's possible that Diddlaw was misleading the public regarding their actions. They also added additional context regarding Ms. Summers, noting that the offer of one-to-one support was still open. The opening paragraph of their updated statement reads as, quote, "Survivors Network is a charity supporting survivors of sexual violence and abuse. We support survivors of all ages and genders in Sussex, and this includes trans and non-binary people. We are committed to intersectionality, and trans-inclusive feminism is central to our ethos. Trans women are women, and as such, they are welcome into all of our women-only spaces." End quote. So a very clear, very strong message of support for the trans community, something that is vital to ensuring trans victims of sexual violence feel able to access said resources. Because even without going to court, the actions of Ms. Summers and Diddlaw can have a chilling effect on victims of sexual violence. It's great to see that trans people aren't being jettisoned as part of a cheap means to save face, that the Survivors Network will fight this, and that they're being represented for free by progressive law firm Reed Smith. Yet, it's still deeply troubling that, no matter what, the Survivors Network is being forced to neglect the rest of its brilliant work to fight this, all because one cis woman couldn't get over the fact that she was told no when she demanded to be allowed to hurt trans people. And this really does demonstrate a pattern of behaviour when it comes to the so-called gender-critical movement, a far-right ideology that seeks to eradicate trans people by forcing us out of public life. Whilst members of the gender-critical ideology love to pretend like they're the ones standing up for women, in truth, they're the ones harming the most vulnerable among us. They're the ones attacking rape crisis centres, domestic violence shelters, and LGBT+ charities. They're the ones seeking to force said services to enact violence against trans women and AMAD trans folk on their behalf. Returning to SPCC Townsend, in her horrific interview with the Daily Mail, she claimed to be speaking on behalf of services like the Survivors Network, pulling a Nixon and claiming that they actually hated the rules laid down by the Equality Act, and yet were too afraid to speak out due to fear of the transgender lobby. Yet, when an actual Survivors Network does speak out, does take a stand, We find Townsend's fearmongering to be nothing more than projection. It is the gender-critical ideology that is threatening not just trans women, but all women, particularly marginalized women. People like Townsend, like Summers, like those working at Diddlaw, everyone espousing the gender-critical ideology is a threat to black women, intersex women, and lesbians. Indeed, they're a threat to any woman, cis and trans, that their fascist ideology deems unfeminine. And that is why the gender-critical ideology is a threat to all women's services. Though this isn't the only pattern we see, we also see the continued use of legal violence by transphobic parties. People like J.K. Rowling, Graham Linehan, Stephanie Davies-Arai have used the threat of defamation lawsuit as a means to silence criticism of their transphobia. Hell, we're currently in the process of fighting fraudulent takedowns issued by Rachel Oates due to us archiving her history of transphobia. Transphobes resorting to legal violence as a means to silence, bully, and coerce trans people and their allies is nothing new. And I'm just glad that, considering the situation they've been forced into, the Survivors Network is fighting back, is taking a stand and going, no, we will not enact violence against trans victims of rape at your demand. Something else that's not all that surprising is Ms. Summers' chummy relationship with anti-Semitism. As mentioned earlier, SPCC Townsend used her position to promote the anti-Semitic conspiracy that there are nefarious forces turning children queer. This is a conspiracy that dates way back, all the way back to Nazi Germany and their raid on the Institute for Sex Research in Berlin. So it comes as little surprise that, when gender-critical ideologues finally do name names as to who they believe is responsible, people like Helen Joyce single out Jewish people. It also comes as little surprise, considering Helen Joyce's position as one of the largest gender-critical voices, to see Ms. Summers thanking Ms. Joyce personally for helping her circumvent Twitter's block feature to harass them on her behalf. Circumventing block features is another common feature of transphobes, so it seems. All of this is interconnected. The anti-Semitism, the anti-black racism, the homophobia, the ableism, the victim blaming, all of this is connected to the transphobia that is taking place here, and we risk everything in ignoring it. I just hope the courts do the right thing and drag Diddlaw for pretending like they're doing this in the name of equality, whilst they're fighting to enable discriminatory violence. I really do. I hope the entire thing blows up in their face and destroys all credibility they've built up over the years, to the point that they can only get fucked up cases like this. I hope their entire thing just falls apart. As for Ms. Summers, I hope she realizes the cruelty and violence she has resorted to, puts that aside, and gets the help she needs in regards to her being raped. But I have to make this clear. I have no sympathy, as a CSA survivor, for someone who is using their status as a rape victim as justification for violence against other rape victims because they belong to a marginalized demographic. Being raped is not an excuse for discrimination any more than growing up in an abusive household is an excuse for domestic abuse. Ms. Summers needs to take responsibility for her own actions and realize that terrorizing rape victims, both cis and trans, will never bring her the closure she needs. If you appreciate what we do here and want to help out, please consider becoming one of our wonderful patrons who make all this possible. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gert Van Voorst, Sosh Daniels, Cthulhu, Higgins the Seagull, and Flynn. And for myself, Udita and Levi, take care now.